The Met Gala happened, and Tyla's sandress made by Balmain is one of the coolest pieces of clothing that I'd seen in a long time. It's simple yet gorgeous, and one of the most interesting takes on the theme of Garden of Time, which most people just took in the stupidest, most literal way to dress their clients in some flower pattern. But this one, referencing of course the sands of time, was different. It featured a sculpted sand dress and an hourglass purse to tie it all together. The bodice was made using a plaster mold, while the organza train contained 3 shades of sand with microcrystal studs for a sparkling finish. And even without knowing much about fashion, I'm sure people can appreciate that creating fabric out of sand, which is small stones, is super impressive. Clearly, it was a work of art. That is, until she was carried up the stairs. And then later for the dress to be cut off when she actually walked into the event. Now, her being carried was not a part of the concept. It didn't add anything to the look. She was carried because she had to be carried. Balmain, one of the best clothes makers in the business, has created a piece of clothing that they think worthy of a museum, and that piece of clothing can't be worn. This situation is not the first of its kind.
My dress is broken.
Today, we see an increasing number of haute couture dresses being created that simply fall apart as they're put on. And this trend is emblematic of a key learning from Kant's aesthetic theory of what it means for something to be beautiful. So this will be my Kantian take on the Met Gala. See, for Kant, when asking the question of what fine art is, he proposes that there are 2 paradoxes that are key to anything being fine art. He says it's a way of presenting that is purposive on its own and that furthers, even though without a purpose, the culture of our mental powers to facilitate social communication. And that it must have the look of nature, even though we are conscious of it as art. In other words, Kant believes that fine art is intentionally produced, yet remains purposive without a purpose, and that it's fabricated and essentially unnatural, but it must appear to be natural to its viewers. Tyla's dress is a good example of failing at both paradoxes. First and foremost, it would fail at being fine art because it belongs in Kant's system as an art, but not fine. Because arts like dressmaking or cooking have a clear use purpose. So when we usually judge whether or not some miso soup was well made, we're not making an aesthetic judgment to say that. We are simply making a judgment of if or if not the miso soup at hand lives up to the idea of miso soup that a chef would be attempting to make. Fine art is purposive without a purpose, so it's not made to be used or judged as anything else than what it is in itself. And that's how great pieces of art can both seem extremely valuable and worthless at the same time. Because we understand that every item in a gallery technically has little value to us unless we urgently need a bunch of objects to burn to keep warm or anything like that. They're not like food or furniture or clothes. But at the same time, art and what is truly beautiful is inherently invaluable. Of course, all clothing fails at meeting the first paradox of Kant. While I'm actually of the belief that any useful art can become a fine art in Kant's system, and does become fine art thanks to our economic development, but that's a whole other argument that I won't bother with right now. But either way, it's uncontroversial to observe that dressmaking would not be considered fine art in the Kantian sense. However, if we do suspend our beliefs for a little while and accept that dresses can also be works of art, then Balmain's attempt at a work of art has failed at being that for a different reason. And that is the second paradox. We have here a dress that is seemingly a work of art. It inspires aesthetic consideration and awe. Kant is perhaps the philosopher who has best described the feeling of being inspired of beauty in the world. Whether it's the natural one or crafted fine arts, it stands that Kant believes that we respond to objects' rightness of design, which satisfies our imagination and our intellect, even though we're not evaluating the object's purpose. So the pleasure that we feel from viewing a beautiful fjord or mountains, as well as a Monet, is derived from the harmony and the free play that is triggered and the purposiveness of its forms. There's something aesthetically pleasing about the, in some ways, perfect arrangements of shapes and colors that causes us pleasure. And there's nothing rational about that experience. It is not that I'm a fisher and I see a fjord and I see its beauty because I can, of course, see special value in bodies of water thanks to my profession. It's not even that the sun rising on the mountain reminds me of home, or my childhood fairy tales that my mom used to tell me, because these would be matters of agreeableness, not of aesthetics. We can know pretty much nothing about art or beauty and still have these very profound aesthetic experiences. And the sandress is just that. It's awe-inspiring, until we're so cruelly ripped out of that experience when we observe the pathetic carrying of the wearer up the stairs. When that happened, we're confronted with the fact that this is indeed a constructed piece that doesn't even manage to be a good piece of art in the artifact sense, because the wearer can't walk up a set of stairs. And these are not very steep stairs. The dress has not been asked to be able to be worn while hiking the Matterhorn. It is failing at being a piece of clothing so fundamentally that it can barely be said to count as that. This is essentially the same as if the paints on Mona Lisa fell apart and started crumbling off because Da Vinci just decided that he wanted to use some revolutionary technique to get a new color or texture, but that technique and color and texture doesn't actually work, so the work is ruined. That would be embarrassing, just as this is embarrassing. And again, some of the leading couturists of our world and our time are fine with creating pieces of clothing that don't meet the basic requirements of being wearable. You have the experience of going from wondering how it's possible to create a work of art like that dress seems, to wondering how it's allowed to show up at the Met Gala with such a technical monstrosity. And if I were to speculate, because as mentioned earlier, this isn't the first time we've seen this type of breakdown as of late, I would venture to guess that it probably has something to do with the times. Because isn't it symbolic that haute couture, which is a category of fashion that's revered for its quality fabrics and craftsmanship, today is littered with dresses falling apart at the seams? Obviously, one can make the deduction that fast fashion's increasing demands might have something to do with it, but these dresses are usually one of a kind. These are not produced en masse, they're supposed to be special peaks of performance. So it doesn't really explain their waning quality, right? What might, though, is the performativity of today's world. As we increasingly rely on digital reproductions and their virality to define our aesthetic success, one can imagine it becomes less important that the quality is or isn't there. As long as there's a shocking element to your art that can be captured on TikTok, then it's adequately sensational. And this is exactly what happened with this dress. In fact, it needing to be carried up the stairs was simply another viral moment for the brand. People found it funny, or opulent even, rather than the complete embarrassment that it really is. This dress can essentially be made of paper the way it falls off the wearer's body. I mean, imagine if it rained. And I think that's interesting, right? We're now at a point where it seems that none of what I've spoken about the inherent need for quality and for it to seem natural even though it's constructed, seems like it really matters anymore, because as long as it's a spectacle, it's worth our time. In fact, things who would be high quality might not even be worth it. I can't imagine Balmain spending years and years developing a sand fabric that was actually wearable, only for it not to go viral at the Met Gala and thus being an abject economic failure. It doesn't pay off necessarily to invest so much into doing actual good work, but at the same time, it's always been that way to some degree. And I think it's actually more about integrity than anything else. Like, if you've just devoted your life to being a designer, one would hope that you wish to actually be one and not just pretend.